Thank you, Duncan. Really appreciate it. Did the recording turn on? Everyone saw the message? All right. So, I'm really glad that you guys are here, going on this journey with me. We've come a long ways. And we've made it through part two of the book, and now we're starting part three. So I think yeah, so I think, and like Duncan said, we're gonna take 2 weeks to go through this section, or this chapter, sorry, because it's long, and rather than try to cram it all in within an hour or an hour and 10 minutes, it just seemed like it would make more sense to kind of spread it out a little and give it a little breathing room. So and we're talking of this, this chapter is called The Archetype of the Alcoholic, which is really um a fundamental kind of concept in the book. I mean, if I wanted the reader to take anything out of the book, it would be this chapter. I think that this is probably, I mean, I think that, so my friend Jay, he read the manuscript, and he gave me some advice about the book. I always thought the first four chapters, with the history and introducing Jaime and then Jung and the connection with Roland and Jung's discovery of his own myth, to me that seemed like the most important stuff that I had to say. But JS, a lot of you guys probably know him. He thought that this was really he called this my calling card. And he said that other, the story actually more should be seen in light of this concept, the archetype of the alcoholic. And so, yeah, and with this, so I've thought a lot about this concept since I wrote this, and it's been about a year and a half, I think, since I wrote this chapter. And I can't, it really has come to shape kind of the way I see the world, not just, the disease of alcoholism and addiction, but more just this sort of this interesting interaction, I think, between my own kind of psyche, my own unconscious, and the world at large. And so, and the thing about this archetype is this concept, I think, is a very it's pretty easy for people in the 12 steps to grasp it because we have a lot of experience in it. And that gives us sort of an advantage because it really allows us to begin to see Jungian psychology in a more broad perspective, and that's important, and I feel like I need to justify that statement a little bit. Like, why is it important that we try to understand what Carl Jung was saying? Like, who cares, right? And obviously every person has to come up with their own reasons why that might be important. But I can tell you that for me, reading Carl Jung had the same effect on me that reading Bill Wilson did the first time I read Bill's story. And I've read a lot of different literature about spirituality, a lot of different angles and authors from different time frames, ancient and modern. And something about Bill Wilson and then something about Carl Jung just really seems to speak to my soul. And for me, the further I get into this concept of depth psychology or Jungian psychology, the more I seem to understand about myself. So that's kind of the whole point of this, and I'm doing my best to try to explain those concepts as I understand them. I'm certainly not an expert, but I don't know. But these I just find so much meaning in this stuff. So, and the archetype of the alcoholic really provides a way for us to dig into these Jungian concepts on a different level. The archetype of the alcoholic is an image of wholeness, and so we're gonna talk about wholeness and what it means. And let's see. So what we've covered to this point is so especially last week and the week before, we talked about how symbols are shaped energies, that beneath the symbols that are housed in the psyche, like the Czar of Heaven, for example, sits the numinosum, and that's an energy field, right? And it's composed of these cosmological opposites, like good and evil, light and dark, positive and negative. And like all energy systems, spiritual power is bipolar in nature. And so in this quote right here, Edinger kind of explains what happens when we go far enough down into the psyche, right? Kind of below all sort of these preliminary symbols. He says that we, and I have to find my screen here. It says if we go back far enough in the psyche, we get to the primordial opposites of Father Nous and Mother Enoia, and there we experience a conflict. And if one endures that conflict without cracking, then God willing, the conjunctio comes into view. It's the same condition which existed prior to the first cellular division, but now it's on a different level because it's being experienced for the first time by our human consciousness. What we're aiming for then is to re-experience the primordial unity consciously, which transforms it into a different thing. And so basically then what he's saying here is we also, like in the physical world as well as in our psyche, we emerged out of a unity, right? Like we used to be a single cell that was then divided into two cells, and then it kept dividing. And that the same thing has happened in our psyche, right? But then eventually, so this split occurs, and the goal of the psychological process or the religious process or the spiritual walk or whatever is to try to get back into that state of unity. And so the archetype of the alcoholic then becomes instrumental. And I find it to be almost like a train stop on the way to this unification, because this archetype will show us, especially us in the 12 steps, what it means both to experience the opposites, right? So rather than just philosophize about them, we get to look at this concept, and it allows us to see how we experience the opposites. But then it also shows us what the unification of the opposites looks like, right? And then once we see it in this specific pattern in the archetype of the alcoholic, then we're going to start to see it really in all kinds of different aspects of our lives, in all of the insoluble psychological dilemmas that we encounter, because they all function on the same kind of pattern, because they're all energies. And so and what plays into this, what becomes really important for us, is to recognize that all of our years of drinking and using, they actually provide, they actually start to count for something as we understand this complex in terms of an archetype. That all of our experience out there tends to play into our experience in recovery, and it shows us what Jungian psychology is all about. So this brings us to, this is part 3 of the book, right? And the part 3 is called The Thirst for Wholeness. And so, and you might have noticed that in each of these parts, right? Part 1, part 2, part 3, and part 4, I start out with a paragraph or two of some basic history, right? So I try to kind of pull the conversation back to earth a little bit and just provide some context, and then boom, we launch again. So what I talk about in the early paragraphs in this chapter and this part are essentially to say that, and what I'm doing is I'm building up to 1961, because in this part, we're going to examine the letters between Wilson and Jung. And that correspondence occurred in 1961. So by 1961, AA had already grown into a pretty large worldwide organization. There was 300,000 members estimated. I can't remember how many countries AA had been established in. They had already had, the world conferences and stuff had started. The traditions were out there. I think the concepts were there or being written. So AA was already kind of this big organization that Bill Wilson was sort of, integral in. And thanks to some of his close associates who kept encouraging him to reach out to Carl Jung, this guy who had played such a key role in establishing Alcoholics Anonymous, Wilson finally decided to write him a letter. And this communication becomes really important, especially the one from Jung, but also Wilson's communication with Jung is also really, they become integral kind of, they're integral to our understanding of what this psychological change is all about. So we're going to examine the letters quite extensively, especially in the next 2 chapters. But this is one of the most important statements in the letter, and this is This is a pretty famous one for those of us in AA. This is Jung to Wilson in 1961. He says Roland, and they're talking about Roland Hazard, because Bill essentially was saying, "Hey, you remember Roland Hazard? Like, I talk about you and him in my book. This is what I say." And Jung says, "Oh yeah, your rendition is accurate, right?" Which probably was a relief to Bill. But then Jung goes off into the kind of the theory, right? And he says Roland's craving for alcohol was the equivalent on a low level of the spiritual thirst of our being for wholeness, expressed in medieval language, the union with God. And so basically, this quote becomes the basis of part 3, the thirst for wholeness. And we're going to look at this thirst for wholeness a little bit deeper. So I say in the book that this is an intangible thirst, right? Our thirst for wholeness is nebulous, and it's nebulous in the same way that the alcoholic's craving for alcohol is nebulous. Both of those, like, psychological cravings, if you will, they're both intangible, and they require a certain level of consciousness in order to realize. The same way that we had to sort of think backwards or do some, I call it spiritual calculus, right? We have to think backwards to recognize the phenomenon of craving. We also don't really recognize our thirst for wholeness until it begins to be quenched, right? And then we look back and we're like, wow, what I wanted my whole life, I've finally found here through a connection to a higher power. So in order to establish this metaphor, Jung uses the famous Psalm 42:1, and it says, "As the hart panteth after the water brooks, so panteth my soul after thee, O God." And so the reason I have a picture of a male deer here is that this verse actually refers to a deer. So the hart is a deer, and but it also is a universal symbol of spiritual renewal, right? Like the heart of humankind or whatever. And that renewal is, so the deer was considered the king of the forest, but it also has the essence of like how the snake sloughs off its skin, right? And that's a symbol of renewal. Same with the deer, because it sheds its horns, so it becomes sort of a symbol of renewal. Okay, and I'm gonna point this out right now. So during this talk, I'm going to get into some symbols, right? So some myths, kind of pulling from some different angles to establish this sort of symbolic realm that we're going to try to, because what we want to do is we want to try to look at the 12 steps from this same sort of symbolical angle. So that's what I'm going to do here. So this image of the deer reminded me of the myth of Actaeon, the hunter, who liked to hunt. And he one day he was out in the middle of the forest hunting for deer with his hounds, and he accidentally stumbled upon a goddess who was bathing. The goddess was Artemis. I think she was a symbol of the moon, and she also symbolized chastity, and she was the goddess of the hunt. And she became outraged that Actaeon had seen her naked, and so she cursed him by turning him into a deer, and then his own hunting dogs then turned on him and captured him and then chewed him to pieces. And that's what you can see taking place in this beautiful painting. So so psychologically, right, if we were just to look at this from like a Jungian perspective, the story tells us how dangerous it is for an underdeveloped male ego to capture a glimpse of the anima, right? That it's dangerous and destructive. That we need to really develop the ego before we go encountering these kind of deeper layers of the unconscious. So, we want to kind of wade in slowly. But and I don't know whether Jung had this myth in mind when he wrote the letter to Wilson, but it wouldn't surprise me if he did, because he would have recognized the symbolism of the deer, and he just was so he loved symbolism so much, so he may have had this in mind. But what I see here with this myth is that it's a great symbol of the alcoholic or the drug addict's plight, right? Or really anyone who needs the 12 steps. In the early days of our using, we sort of capture a glimpse, right, of this spiritual connection, and we get it through intoxication. but when that happens, we're still uninitiated, right? It's as if we're spying on one of the goddesses bathing when we're getting drunk and feeling so spiritually connected. Um, Also, an interesting corollary is that if bottles are a symbol, like Wilson says, they would be a symbol of the feminine element since they are containers, right? So this kind of works on multiple layers. But obviously, so by spying on the goddess bathing, we have to sort of pay for that sin of learning too much too soon. And so the very thing that we're using to quench our thirst for wholeness then turns on us, right? The hounds turn on us and tear us to shreds. But so that's a good myth of sort of, or a good kind of metaphor of alcoholism. But then the story of but this is a regenerative myth, right? So we want to look at what happens after the hounds tear us to pieces, and that reminds me of another myth, and I'm going to read that. So I said that the deer is like the king of the forest, right? Um, and if so, and the thing about all of these myths, right, is we can take these images and then we kind of piece them together, and they form like a long narrative, like a story. And really, the story is kind of indicative of what is taking place in the hidden realm of the psyche during the psychological transformation. Most of the transformation is taking place in the unconscious. We only feel the effects of it in consciousness when we kind of react and see the world differently. That's indicative of a change having already occurred in the unconscious. And the myths then become sort of a window into the unconscious where we can see, almost in symbolic terms, we can see what that change is and what's taking place. So this is another story about a king and basically what happens to when so after Actaeon is torn to pieces by the dogs. This myth could come in to kind of explain what happens next. So, and I'm just going to read this. It says, so basically what's happening here is there's a king, and the king of the land emerges from his castle. This is an alchemical story, by the way. So the king emerges from the castle and he begins to make unconscious demands right away of his people, right, of his subjects. This is what he said. So this is the king talking. He says, "I demand the water which is closest to my heart and which likes me above all things." When the servant brought it, the king drank so much that all his limbs were filled and his veins inflated, and he himself became discolored. His soldiers urged him to mount his horse, but he said he could not. "I am heavy and my head hurts me, and it seems to me as though all my limbs were falling apart." He demanded to be placed in a heated chamber where he could sweat the water out. By the way, this story is kind of correlates so highly with alcoholism that Jung in Mysterium Conjunctionis, where he shares this, actually had to comment, and he says specifically that they weren't talking about an alcoholic king, that it was something else. But either way, it still fits so closely. But when after a while they opened the chamber, the king lay there as if dead. They summoned the Egyptian and the Alexandrian physicians, who at once accused one another of incompetence. Finally, the Alexandrian physicians gave way to the Egyptian physicians, who tore the king into little pieces, ground them to powder, mixed them with their moistening medicines, and put the king back in his heated chamber as before. After some time, they fetched him out again half dead. When those present saw this, they broke out into a lamentation, crying, "Alas, the king is dead." The physician said soothingly that he was only sleeping. They then washed him with sweet water until the juice of the medicines departed from him and mixed him with new substances. Then they put him back in the chamber as before. When they took him out this time, he was really dead. And so, in other words, this first group of physicians, they can't really get the king put back together, right? And I want to mention, just in this imagery, right? This is an alchemical image of the king inside of the heated chamber. All of these other sort of angels on the outside, those are representative of the gods, right? And they actually represent the 7 planets. So you have the moon, and then the sun. I think the sun is the fire, and then each of the other planets is there: Jupiter, Saturn, Mars, Venus, Mercury. So the king is in his chamber, and he is the sun, right? The king is the sun, and he's holding the earth, which is the upside down Venus symbol. Anyways, this, and again, this is a reflection of what's taking place inside of the psyche during this transformation. Now, I'm going to read the second part of this little myth here. Oh, did it? There we go. So again, they put the king back in the chamber. He comes out, he's really dead. And the physicians say, we have killed him that he may become better and stronger in this world after his resurrection on the day of judgment. The king's relatives, however, considered them mountebanks or scammers. They took their medicines away from them and drove them out of the kingdom. They now wanted to bury the corpse, but the Alexandrian physicians, this second group of physicians, who had heard of these happenings, counseled them against it and said they would revive the king. Though the relatives were very mistrustful, they let them have a try. The Alexandrian physicians took the body, ground it to powder a second time, washed it well until nothing of the previous medicine remained, and dried it. Then they took 1 part of the sal ammoniac and 2 parts of Alexandrian nitrate, mixed them with the pulverized corpse, made it into a paste with a little linseed oil, and placed it in a crucible-shaped chamber with holes bored in the bottom. Beneath it, they placed a clean crucible and let the corpse stand so for an hour. Then they heaped page fire upon it and melted it so that the liquid ran into the vessel below, whereupon the king rose up from death and cried in a loud voice, "Where are my enemies? I shall kill them all if they do not submit to me." So again, so essentially then what happens, the king is torn to shreds, just like Actaeon was torn to shreds. And as images of what takes place behind the background of the psyche, right? This is a really great image of like the need to dry out for the alcoholic. I find that imagery, the fact that we say that we have to dry out, it's very alchemical in nature, right? Because of this fire element and the fact that the king had to sweat out all of this extra water. It's also interesting that the second set of doctors had to completely erase the influence of the first set. And then they actually added salt to the recipe, right? And salt is a symbol of like the knowledge of the earth, and sort of the deeper knowledge of the collective psyche, right? So from a psychological perspective, what was missing from the first set of instructions was an unconscious element, or there was a lack of an archetypal perspective. And then obviously what emerges then is this new king. And the king is a representative of the ego, right? So what basically the ego is the king who gets sick and dies, and then the physicians revive the king, and a new ego sort of bursts forth with a new perspective, right? Somebody who perhaps has like turned their will and their life over to the care of God. That's what we would maybe say in the 12 steps. Now, so with this sort of strong symbolical look at this, I want to turn to the 12 steps now. And because the kind of the point of
Cody seems to be frozen for the moment. Just to give it a moment, folks.
I'm going to call him.
Hopefully he has not lost his internet. He's still here, so maybe it's just slow. Okay, I think maybe he's rejoining. Just stand by, folks. Hopefully, just be a moment. Right.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes. Welcome back.
Sorry about that. Let me just make sure my audio is correct here. Okay. Yeah, sorry. So I'm going to reshare the screen. So I don't know where it cut off, but I'll just start over with this slide. So basically, we're trying to look at we're looking at the 12 steps from this symbolical angle, right? This hyper symbolized perspective. because that's how we're gonna. That's how we're gonna allow it to sort of uncover and kind of dismantle all of the unconscious elements, right? Sort of disintegrate them and sort of put them in the oven and cook them and bake a new conscious dominant, the ego. So, and what's at the center of this myth then is the anonymous alcoholic. And that's the character that Bill Wilson created, this prototypal character that he created purposefully as a psychological mirror for his readers. And that's a really important idea, right? Because all myth is meant to be reflective of our own. So when we read a mythological story, just like with our dreams, we want to see ourselves in each of the characters, right? That the whole thing is telling about our own transformation. And so the 12 steps are the same way. So, and basically though, and what we see with the 12 steps is that underlying psychological those energies, right, of the highest and the lowest, those permeate the 12-step myths. And because of the dichotomous nature, the anonymous alcoholic becomes a really effective symbol at understanding psychological transformation in today's world. Probably the most, I mean, and this is why the 12 steps are so effective. You know, even though they're basically unknown in the broader community, like we've got our finger on the pulse of what it means to experience a psychic change. So to understand the character of the anonymous, and I introduced the anonymous alcoholic last week too. So we're going to expand on that a little bit. So this anonymous alcoholic is this character, and to understand how this character shows up, right? Like maybe in Bill Wilson's mind, we're going to do a little bit more, spiritual calculus, if you will. And this statement comes from this woman. Sorry, I have to find my there we go. This statement comes from an astrologer who's also a Jungian analyst, and I really like her stuff. And this is what she says. She says that every archetype is a potential symbol, which means to say that the form it takes when manifesting itself can be represented by a symbol. For example, the mother archetype can be symbolized as a fountain, a yoni, etc. Thus, each symbol is determined by an archetype which is not perceptible in itself. In essence, an archetype is a compressed center of psychic energy, and the symbol is attached to it to make it visible. With this in mind, Jung described a symbol as an aspect and image of psychic energy. So, going back to what Jung said about symbols as shaped energies, right? The energy that he's talking about then is what he would also refer to as an archetype. So archetypes are bundles of psychic energy that exist in the unconscious. And essentially what happens is these energies, when they emerge, right, they usually will produce symbols, which are these paradoxical images that represent both sides of this psychic energy. So what this means then is, if we have this mythological character called the anonymous alcoholic, then what that means is that symbol derived from a center of psychic energy below it, right? And actually, I believe this happened in Bill Wilson's mind, even though he wasn't conscious of it. But what emerged was the archetype of the alcoholic, because the archetype of the alcoholic then is a manifestation in form of the energy in the psyche or in the unconscious that constellates this kind of, well, it constellates in alcoholism as well as the anonymous alcoholic. So, and it permeates recovery. So, and this is what I say, in here, I'm going to just do this real fast. When it got cut off, my screens got misaligned. So, all right, good. Now, so I'm going to read this. This is right out of the book. It says, the archetype of the alcoholic, an archetype emerges. The universality of our spiritual thirst for wholeness permits us to view Wilson's central character in the Big Book as a metaphor of our unfulfilled longing for union with God. In this light, the anonymous alcoholic reflects our failed hope to reach the divine, just as the characters of the ancient myths are meant to do. And as with all religious symbols, there's an ancient energy underlying the anonymous alcoholic that, in the Jungian tradition, I have named the archetype of the alcoholic, a paradoxical figure representative of the fusion of opposites that takes place in recovery. So last week we saw that fusion of opposites, right? And that Wilson had found a middle way, safer and protected between the highest and the lowest. And that juxtaposition or that spectrum of energy is this thing, the archetype of the alcoholic. And so we basically now with all archetypes essentially, and really everything in the psyche from how I understand it, that all functions out of the same sort of patterns, right? So if we can understand the fundamentals kind of structure of the archetype of the alcoholic, which should be easy for anybody in recovery, then we can really transfer that knowledge to other aspects of the psyche, kind of like I said before. This is author Jolande Jacobi. She speculates about, and I don't know if it's a sheer here, I need to do more research. I read this in a book. So this is what she says about these archetypes. Each archetype can develop and differentiate endlessly. It can branch like a tree and blossom 1,000-fold. There seems to be no answer to the question of whether there are many primitive impulses to form, i.e. archetypes. In the last analysis, we can fall back on the possibility inherent in typical fundamental experiences. Who knows? Maybe they can be reduced to a unity consisting of two basic opposites such as light and dark or heaven and earth, the groundwork of creation itself. The deeper the layer at which a given archetype lies in the unconscious, the simpler will be its metaphorical language and the more meaning will reside within it, waiting for unfoldment, and therefore the more significant it will be. So what this person is speculating is whether there are actually many different archetypes in the psyche, or if whether they can all just kind of be boiled down to like one main fundamental archetype. And so you'll recall the quote we read from Ettinger in the beginning, where he says that underneath all of these energies really is just the masculine and feminine split, right? Of Father Nous and Mother Anoia. And personally, I actually think that would be at the base, that masculine feminine juxtaposition. But who knows? This stuff's in the unconscious, so it's like impossible to say. But once we understand how the archetype of the alcoholic functions, then we can kind of understand more of what's taking place in the psychic background. So Jung said that archetypes are continually recurrent expressions. And to understand that, so an archetype is something that actually kind of exists in every single human experience, right? And in terms of the archetype of the alcoholic, there's a few really kind of clear expressions of this in modern culture. So one is just the fact that the 12-step fellowships have now sort of disseminated in over 400 different organizations, right? There's a different 12-step fellowship for almost every single compulsive behavior, for mental illness, for all kinds of things. And some of those fellowships actually use the book Alcoholics Anonymous as their basic text. So they already see the word alcohol, alcoholism, the alcoholic. They see those words as symbols already of their own experience in combating the mystery of compulsion. So that's really good evidence of the existence of the archetype of the alcoholic. Other kind of clear-cut examples, and I give some of these in the book, is just the fact that, like, now, I mean, and if you guys were on the call yesterday with Ian, just this sort of the idea that we can increase our spiritual connection through the use of psychedelics, and just how popular that idea has become across the entire culture, that is also very indicative of the presence of the archetype of the alcoholic, right? That there's this sort of, and again, if we go back to our longing for wholeness, right? Our thirst for wholeness, the alcoholic archetype is really fundamental in that thirst for wholeness. And so that's why people are drawn to the use of intoxicants in order to achieve a greater sense of spiritual connection. They're trying, even though they don't know it, they're trying to tap into the energy of the archetype of the alcoholic. So archetypes, I've said this 100 times. I'll say it 100 more probably. Archetypes are composed of an energy field that correlates to the highest religious experience and the lowest, most depraved evil of the human condition, right? And just like positive and negative electricity, both sides of that energy field are required to produce power. And what happens here, though, so we've seen that these archetypes can manifest as symbols, right? But they also manifest as neuroses. And this happens when an ego becomes over-identified with the energy of these archetypes. So Jungians call this an unconscious identification. And so that's why in active alcoholism, basically what's happening is the person becomes unconsciously identified with the archetype of the alcoholic. So, and that actually correlates with 12-step recovery, right? Because the way we break that unconscious identification with that energy is by taking step one. And we don't necessarily take step one. The ego is forced to admit that it is powerless over alcohol. So what happens is that identification with the archetype actually becomes conscious, right? By me admitting that I'm powerless over alcohol, that my life is unmanageable, is me taking a step in consciousness of saying, yes, this sort of hidden psychological energy that Bill Wilson rightly calls the alcoholic mind, it's got me, right? And I've been driven by it. And that creates that break between unconscious identification. So, and let's see here. I'm going to read this. This kind of this gets at how these archetypes, how they manifest in culture in general. Broadly speaking, the mysticism surrounding intoxication is evidence of the presence of the alcoholic. Anytime and by the way, whenever you see the alcoholic like that in capitals, with italics, that's a reference to the archetype of the alcoholic. Anytime we seek a transformative spiritual experience induced through intoxication, whether that be through using psychedelics or some other intoxicant, we are channeling the power of the archetype. For example, the practice now in vogue in some post-Jungian circles of using mind or mood-altering substances to enhance the analytical process evidences the presence of the archetype of the alcoholic. Another example is found in Michael Pollan's best-selling book, How to Change Your Mind, where he makes a strong case for the use of psychedelics as a means to enhance one's spiritual connection, further evidence of the energy of the alcoholic at work in the modern psyche. Even William James seems to have been swayed by the archetype of the alcoholic, using nitrous oxide as a way to access the mystical. He quotes the Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy in Varieties. Quote, "One can live only so long as one is intoxicated, drunk with life. But when one grows sober, one cannot fail to see that it is all a stupid cheat." Finally, we mustn't overlook either Bill Wilson's foray into the world of psychedelics in the 1950s or Jaime's in the early 1920s as other clear cases of the power of this paradoxical image and the inevitable shortcomings of reliance on this method alone to quench the intangible thirst of our being for wholeness. 4. While imbibing any kind of intoxicant certainly evokes an expansion of consciousness, the fullness of the archetype of the alcoholic cannot be experienced until we find a way to improve our conscious contact with the universal mind while in a state of abstinence, as James intimated. So, archetypes, as we said, they don't always manifest in the material world as symbols, right? And one of the recurrent themes of part 3 is that essentially these unconscious energies often will bubble up and manifest as neuroses or as complexes, right? So often depth psychology is also called complex psychology, because so for Jung, the complex would be sort of any autonomous aspect of the psyche that drives the ego. So alcoholism would be a complex, addiction is a complex, the self is a complex, the anima is a complex. So the complexes are those driving factors of the psyche. Alcoholism and addiction are, so I make the case in this part that alcohol and addiction are part of a collective complex, right? And that it grows, that this is a response, I guess, to our culture's lack of symbolic connection. So, in other words, the spiritual malady that we are trying to treat here in recovery, which we're going to talk about as sort of the death of the God image, that spiritual malady that we treat is also the cause of alcoholism and addiction on a global scale, right? So the archetype of the alcoholic is manifesting on a global scale, mostly in its unconscious pattern. And this is evident in many cultures throughout the world. One of the examples I use in the book is that of the Native Americans of the Northern Plains. And I'll read this. It says, it has been our culture's lack of an effective living connection to myth that gave rise to the prevailing socio-spiritual condition that constellates the negative aspect of the archetype of the alcoholic throughout the world. The scale at which the disease of alcoholism has inflicted the West is indicative of just how hollow our relationship to our God image has become, how waning the health of our religions, whose message has lost its meaning and value. The American Indians of the Great Plains provide a disturbing case in point of how the lack of connection to a meaningful mythology can lead to a sweeping outbreak of alcoholism and addiction like the one we're witnessing today. After the U.S. government decimated the natives' God image, systematically slaughtering the sacred buffalo, alcoholism emerged among the tribes as a widespread chronic illness. Having witnessed the murder of their mythological symbols, the tribe's people lost a vital connection with the Great Spirit, and in their longing to find what went missing, a deadly and destructive compulsion emerged from the depths of their collective unconscious, erupting into a culture-wide epidemic. And we basically see the same thing happening in the West. And so I'll read this next slide. This is just 3 paragraphs right in a row. Likewise, in the West, the widespread nature of the disease of alcoholism is highly reflective of the anemic state of our current collective spiritual well-being, stemming from our inability to reconcile our myths with a modern scientific worldview. Jung discovered this phenomenon poking through the writings of Friedrich Nietzsche, who had boldly declared that the West no longer needed access to a living God image. In a lecture series he presented in the spring of 1934 on Nietzsche's philosophical novel Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Jung explored the psychology around Nietzsche's denial of the thirst for wholeness, which diverted the energy of the numinosum, causing it to bubble up from the unconscious through its negative aspect in the form of an acute neurosis, which, Jung says, Nietzsche then unconsciously projected into the characters of his fiction. Observing the impact of this spiritual malaise among those who showed a tendency towards substance abuse, Jung explained, spirit is also the source of inspiration and of enthusiasm because it is a welling up. The German word Geist, i.e. spirit, is a volcanic eruption, a geyser. That aspect of the spirit is the reason why alcohol, for instance, is called spirit. Alcohol is the reduced form of spirit. Therefore, many people lacking spirit take to drink. They fill themselves with alcohol. I have seen many a case of that sort. It is typical for men, though women do it too. And so, as we look at this, Nietzsche's denial of the God image, right? And then and how Jung says that basically what happens is these neuroses will kind of bubble up in the form, it's like a geyser, right? And that he thinks that the reason alcohol is called spirits is because it has the same sort of numinous manifestation in human life, so that it bubbles up, this addiction to alcohol or drugs or whatever, it bubbles up from the unconscious and basically creates problems. And the fact that we lack spirit is why we take to drink, because spirit tends to be a good replacement for spiritus. So, and I want to talk about the death of the God image, right? And because that is the spiritual malady, and we've talked a lot already, especially in the last part of the book, that psychological transformation really boils down to the transformation of the God image, right? And so, if in Western culture God is dead, which I think is an accurate statement, then our job is to sort of resurrect the gods. So if we go back to that alchemical recipe, right? If and this is true, is that the king represents the image, the conscious dominant, the God image, right? And it's our job as sort of the physicians, if you will, is to run the king to to assimilate that, right? To chew it up, grind it up, put it into the pot, add some salt, whatever it is, and then run it and then burn it and try to reassimilate it, right? And give it new life so that, just like when the king emerged out of the hermetic vessel, he was ready for battle. And so we're trying to recreate the God image as we recreate ourselves. Those two things kind of go hand in hand. So talking about the death of the God image, though, I really like this because and I got this from Edinger, that he tells about that Plutarch had told a similar story as Nietzsche, back in like the 1st century AD, about the death of the great Pan. And I'll just read this. It says, and this is Plutarch talking about his friend. Plutarch says, "My friend said that once upon a time in making a voyage to Italy, he embarked on a ship carrying freight and many passengers. It was already evening when, near the Echinades Islands, the wind dropped and the ship drifted near Poxy. Almost everybody was awake, and a good many had not finished their after-dinner wine. Suddenly from the island of Poxy was heard the voice of someone loudly calling Thamus, so that all were amazed. Thamus was an Egyptian pilot, not known by name even to many on board. Twice he was called and made no reply, but the third time he answered, and the caller, raising his voice, said, 'When you come opposite to Palodes, announce that great Pan is dead.' On hearing this, all were astounded and reasoned among themselves whether it were better to carry out the order to refuse to meddle and let the matter go. Under the circumstances, Thamus made up his mind that if there should be a breeze, he would sail past and keep quiet, but with no mind and a smooth sea about the place, he would announce what he had heard. So, when he came opposite Palodes, and there was neither wind nor wave, Thamus from the stern, looking toward the land, said the words as he heard them, 'Great Pan is dead.' Even before he had finished, there was a great cry of lamentation, not of one person, but of many, mingled with exclamations of amazement. As many persons were on the vessel, the story was soon spread abroad in Rome, and Thamus was sent for by Tiberius Caesar. Tiberius became so convinced of the truth of the story that he caused an inquiry to an investigation to be made about Pan." And so, it's not the first time, I guess, that God has died, right? In Western culture, there was huge kind of uproars and upheavals were happening in terms of religion in Rome, right around this time, and it's very interesting because that's when Jesus supposedly was walking the earth. And there is some speculation that because of the time frame when this story occurred, that he was actually talking about Jesus, that Jesus had died. And there's a lot of interesting parallels. I mean, Christianity was the only religion that was persecuted, by the Roman Empire, right? And then, but it had so much kind of energy behind it that it would eventually kind of grow and spread and become the religion of Rome. But and I think it's safe to say that in the world today, 2,000 years later, we're undergoing the same giant kind of transformation on a collective scale, right? That the God image is dead, and our job is to try to do our best to revive it. And so it's really interesting because and Jung kind of helped, I guess he helped me understand is that these transformations take place both on an individual scale as well as on a global scale, and that the transformations look the same for both the individual as well as the collective, right? That I'm experiencing the same thing inside as the collective psychology is experiencing, sort of as one unit. And so for there to be widespread change, right, it means that the vast majority of individuals have to also experience this change within them. So I want to look at the famous modern equivalent to the death of God in Nietzsche's Zarathustra. And again, I got this from Edinger in his book, Mysterium Lectures. And this is how Edinger tells the story about Zarathustra. And this is where Nietzsche proclaims that God was dead, in case you were wondering, like I was. So, and this is how it goes. Let me just start out with an introduction. So at the beginning of Nietzsche's account, Zarathustra descends from his mountain. He's the main character. Zarathustra descends from his mountain retreat, and he's going to go out and start preaching his new message to the people. And on his way down the mountain, he's going through the forest, and he encounters an ascetic hermit, a saint. And this is where the story picks up. And what is the saint doing in the forest? Asked Zarathustra. The saint answered, "Is my screen sharing paused?" Oh, it says it's paused right here. You guys can see my screen? Okay, good. The saint answered, "I make songs and sing them, and when I make songs, I laugh, cry, and hum. Thus I praise God. With singing, crying, laughing, and humming, I praise the God who is my God." When Zarathustra had heard these words, he bade the saint farewell and said, "Let me go quickly, lest I take something from you." And thus they separated, the old one and the man, laughing as two boys laughed. But when Zarathustra was alone, he spoke thus to his heart. Could it be possible? This old saint in the forest has not yet heard anything of this, that God is dead. Then later on, Zarathustra encounters what he calls the ugliest man, a very disgusting creature who represents the repressed, neglected, disregarded shadow aspect of humanity. And the ugliest man says this: "Zarathustra, Zarathustra, guess my riddle. Speak, speak. What is the revenge against the witness?" That's his riddle. And Zarathustra responds to the ugliest man. "I recognize you well," he said in a voice of bronze. "You are the murderer of God. You could not bear him who saw you, who always saw you through and through. You ugliest man. You took revenge on this witness." That's the meaning of revenge against the witness. There follows a lot of interchange that I'm, Edinger, leaving out. And in fact, the ugliest man says, "Okay, Zarathustra, you've guessed my riddle, my worst riddle, what I did." Then he continues, "But he had to die." And this is the ugliest man speaking. "He saw with eyes that saw everything. He saw man's depths and ultimate grounds, and all his concealed disgrace and ugliness. He crawled into my dirtiest nooks. This most curious, over-obtrusive, over-pitying one had to die. He always saw me. On such a witness, I wanted to have revenge or not live myself. The God who saw everything, even man, this God had to die. Man cannot bear that such a witness should live." And so it's pretty interesting, right, that for Nietzsche, and recall that Jung says that Nietzsche essentially casts this unconscious stuff happening, and he sort of projects it into his myth. Thus spoke Zarathustra. We're going to see later on in the conclusion that Bill Wilson was kind of doing the same thing in the book Alcoholics Anonymous. He was literally projecting his own psychology into the book. And what we but basically, so what's interesting here is that Nietzsche's shadow is the one who kills God, because it can't bear being looked at, right? And also, I think for us alcoholics or drug addicts too, that's kind of the basis of our problem, right? Is that we just have such a hard time seeing our shadow, and we try to hide behind intoxication and whatnot. So Edinger goes on to show that basically the death of God has a great effect on the collective psyche, right? On the masses. And Jung talks about this too, that basically the death of the God image it signifies really like violence and despair on a worldwide scale, which is sort of what we're seeing today, right? And what we've seen with world wars and everything else. And so that's what's happening on this collective scale. But the thing is too, is that this energy, right, that's so destructive worldwide, it tends to, in my mind at least, and I think David Shane actually agrees with this aspect, right, is that collective shadow, if you will, is what sort of emerges and bubbles up into the life of the alcoholic and the drug addict. and so David Shane and I talked about this, right? Because last week I brought up that he speaks of alcoholism and drug addiction as an unintegratable evil. And he clarified that for me through some emails, where what he's saying is unintegratable is this thing that I'm talking about here, this collective kind of evil that's ruining the world. And he also agrees that that's what kind of bubbles up individually into alcoholism. But where we disagree is whether or not, for us individually, is whether it is actually integratable. And I believe that it is integratable, and that's what we're doing in the 12 steps. So, and this is out of the book, a paragraph that just says, as a culture's religious myths lose sway, a compensating energy wells up in the collective psychology as overpowering primordial forces meant to drive us toward wholeness emanate from a darker, more archaic aspect in the psyche, influencing certain individuals so profoundly that they become acutely neurotic, which often manifests as alcoholism and or addiction. Thus, in addition to the spiritual implications we've been examining that are necessary for one to achieve a full recovery from the disease, a corresponding spiritual basis colors the dark and compulsive behavior that defines active alcoholism as well. Understanding that, Jung explained that the best treatment for such neurotic addictive states is found in cultivating a symbolic life, encouraging us to find a way to address what he calls the daily need of the soul. And what tends to bubble up then is is this collective shadow. And so, and then let's see. So, and I just want to read this. Let's see. I'm thinking, because I'm trying to figure out where to stop, because we're going to split this into 2 paragraphs. I think I'll read, or into two weeks. I think I'll read this one too. So here we talk about the art. So we're going back to the archetype of the alcoholic, and we're sort of putting it within the context of this shadow, right? This whether it's the collective shadow or how it manifests as in the individual shadow. Bill Wilson's statement that bottles are a symbol underscores the universal nature of our spiritual thirst for wholeness. From a psychological perspective, the drama that his character endures is the same journey symbolized by every Western myth. The mechanism in the mind that deludes the anonymous alcoholic into thinking he will somehow someday control and enjoy his drinking is the same one that tricks all of us into believing that our ego is steering the ship, that we have ultimate control over every aspect of our lives. An unconscious compulsion to drink is what finally leads alcoholics to experience what Wilson called in his letter to Jung, ego collapse at depth. All humans are driven by unconscious compulsions. Indeed, to be human means to encounter compulsivity. Jung says that compulsion is the most baffling aspect of our existence, the great mystery of human life. For while the ego might think it is always in charge, in fact, there is another psychic complex that does most of the driving, which Jung called the shadow. And similar to how it manifested in Nietzsche's Zarathustra, that shadow complex, typically hidden, is often quite visible in the life of a chronic alcoholic. Therefore, one of the primary functions of the archetype of the alcoholic is to illuminate the shadowy, compulsive parts of our psyche that are eclipsed by a delusion of control. And so basically, where the archetype of the alcoholic becomes really useful, especially to those of us who sort of maybe have identified with it or who can recognize its existence in our lives, is that it helps us to. So when we talk about doing shadow work, right, the archetype of the alcoholic really gives us a springboard from which to really understand what the shadow is, what it does, how it manifests in our life, what we can do about it, and to recognize it as another autonomous psychic complex, right? Which is, Wilson calls it the alcoholic mind. And I think that's such a great depiction, because it really gets to the fact that these unconscious complexes, they actually dominate over the ego. We like to think that the ego's always in charge. And so we suffer from a delusion of control, because as Jung said, compulsion is the great mystery of human life. In other words, we don't actually always get to choose what's happening to us or what we're doing or what we're going to drink next, or you know what I mean? All that stuff. And so, but underneath all of this, right, is the complex, right, of or what I call the archetype of the alcoholic. Really, the archetype of the alcoholic is, it's really the archetype of compulsion, at least one of the most effective ones. Um, so, and I think I'm going to end right there, because next week we're going to get into the trickster, and we're going to talk about how the trickster tricks the alcoholic into making, choices that he wouldn't choose otherwise. So, and that leaves us, a good amount of time to get basically the second half of this chapter done. So I'll stop sharing my screen now. And I hope it was all right. I don't know how much is coming through because I'm on my phone. So hopefully you guys were able to hear most of it. Let's see.
Thank you, Cody. Let's all unmute and create a collective sounds and movements of appreciation for author Cody Peterson.
Thank you
Yes.
very
Thank you,
much.
Cody.
Yes.
Thank
Thank
you,
you,
Cody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
We heard
you.
all of it too.
You
We heard
are.
all of it.
Everything.
Yes. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone. Now we'll start to move here toward our Q&A session. Thanks, Cody. I could not tell that you were on your phone. Everything was the same except when you froze and disappeared for a moment. Everything was fine. Okay, this is the time we'll open for questions and answers. Each person will have about 1 minute to reflect and to ask a question, and Cody will do his best to answer. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand. And the first I see is Patrick in Cologne.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Cody. Hello, everybody. This is wonderful. I've got about 15 questions, but Cody, you mentioned the psychic force, the archetype, and the symbol. And you took an example of the mother, for example, and that the symbol could be a fountain, right? And I get two of those three. I get the psychic force, I get the archetype of the anonymous alcoholic. But what I don't grasp is what, in that perspective, then what are the symbols?
Well, no, that's a great question. So, so the way I would answer that, it would be to just kind of tweak what you said only slightly. So we have the symbol, and then we have the archetype, and then we have the energy. So the symbol is the anonymous alcoholic. The archetype is the energy that creates the anonymous alcoholic. So, so that's how I would, and then like other symbols would be the bottle. I think I would have to, because in the 12 steps, the symbols are a little more differentiated, right? So they're kind of harder to see as symbols, whereas in the old myths, it's just all symbolism, right? So, but and Ben Thompson and I are gonna probably do some seminars on this, like specifically what are the symbols in the 12 steps. Ben's, he's a Harvard guy and he's a researcher and stuff. So his case is that our whole reality is dictated by symbols. And that, we have these stories that we tell, and our stories are symbols, and we are symbols, and the people in our lives are symbols. So, I guess that what's underneath these symbols, like in the psyche, are these pockets of energy, and they kind of expressed into the world through symbols, as well as through neuroses. And I think that's also interesting. Like Jung said that, for example, like in terms of the devil, he says in medieval times, they had a character, a mythological symbol called the devil. And he said, today we have what we call neuroses, right? And so they're essentially the same thing, right? They're both they're both metaphors, I guess, for a certain autonomous psychic complex that drives us to do certain things. And so that becomes kind of a key way of understanding Jung's perspective of the world, was that and so, like, for example, too, so like all the Greek pantheon, right, it's essentially like an array of different human emotions and human natures and human desires and drives. And so, like, in ancient Greece, you would have said, oh, Eros has got me, right, when you fell in love with somebody, because so there's a recognition there that this is happening to me, that I don't really have a choice in the matter. And so, it used to be the symbols were dominating us. Now now we just know that it's the unconscious. So I hope that helps or makes sense. And if you have any more questions.
Okay, well, the blackout, for example, could also be a symbol, right?
Oh yeah, that's a great
problem.
symbol.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
So my understanding is that the archetype of the anonymous alcoholic, and is that correct? Is it the anonymous alcoholic or is it the alcoholic?
Yeah, so the archetype is the alcoholic.
Okay.
The character is the anonymous alcoholic.
Okay.
And that is the we of Alcoholics Anonymous, right?
And it's really about compulsion. So in fact, it could be, for example, we could relabel it the archetype of the wounded child from the dysfunctional family.
I mean, that's absolutely. I think that that's an IFS. Is that an IFS kind of? Yeah, so I think it's the same. I think that I think the IFS is just like a slightly more differentiated version of Jungian psychology.
Okay. And the union that you described at the beginning, I find, is captured by Silkworth when he talks about ease and comfort.
Mm.
That's what he's talking about. It's that sense of belonging. Unity consciousness is a kind of a highfalutin name for it, but I think that's what I was looking for in the bottle for all those years. And I found it when I came into the rooms. So thank you.
Thank you. And I relate too. That's what I was looking for, and thank God for the rooms, because it gave me a pathway to find what I was really desiring the whole time. So, Melissa, you want me to call? You're muted, Duncan.
Oh, sorry. Before we go to Melissa, there's a question already in the chat. Perhaps the symbol is an object of engagement, intention, contemplation.
I think so. I think that we do live in a world full of symbols. But I think that we have grown so far away from that symbolical kind of perspective. Jung was blown away that Mountain Lake actually believed that his ancestors, and that him with his prayers was helping the sun to cross the sky each day, and just the simplicity of that belief, right? So the alchemical pictures that I showed, and I meant to explain, but maybe I did, but the planets, right, that were around the king. So in ancient times, right, like even recently, 200 or 300 years ago, like a fundamental understanding of the universe was that the heavens were layered, and that each of the planets was kind of circling, creating an orb around the earth. So, and it was layered like this, and that the energies were coming down out of the heavens, like out of the furthest layers, filtering through these planets and then landing on us or in us. And that's how they saw the world. And so each of these planets represented a different aspect of what it means to be human. And that's where we get astrology from, right? And so these symbols become dominants in our consciousness. And then the question is, how do we relate to these different energies? So we call them energies, right? They called them gods, So I think, to answer the question, I can look at this tree right here, and that can be I can contemplate this tree. So yes, like by all means, you know, there's many symbols. We're surrounded by them every day. So
Thanks, Cody. Melissa? No? Deborah? Oh. Deborah?
I can't, okay, fine, I got unmuted. Hi, thank you so much, Cody. Thank you, Duncan. Um, so, I don't have formulate my question, but I was kind of spinning off with the idea of, most traditions have like a requirement to go through initiation or like kind of and then a boot camp kind of thing. And then there's the discipleship, right? Well, and, the mentorship before there's a distrust for someone jumping into the mystical experience unless they've gone through those steps. So I was wondering if you want maybe you could talk about tying that part in. I mean, we understand the sponsorship thing and yeah, I'll leave it like that. Thank you.
yeah, so I think that, you know, the myth of Actaeon, which we talked about earlier, I think that's kind of what you're referring to, right? Is that he stumbles onto this thing that he's not supposed to see, and it becomes really quite dangerous for him, actually deadly. I you know I think it is interesting. I mean, I don't know how to answer that, because on one hand, like, yes, I think that it is important that we are properly initiated. But also I think there's something to be said about bounding through the forest recklessly and stumbling on a god, right? That because in terms of these collective spiritual programs, there is something that, to me, I think that the ceremonies are important. They have there's a lot of symbolism tied to them, etc. But also, like, if there's any sort of sense of like, hey, you know, this is only this kind of knowledge is only for the more initiated, right? So if they're trying to control the information, then I think it could be troublesome. So that's why I think Jung talks about individuation, that the goal is to really separate ourselves from the collective psychology, and to and we can only do that, we have to find our own way. It really is, it has to be our own, it has to be our own myth, our own understanding, our own whatever it is. And our dreams will sort of plot the map, you know, if you will, in that process. So
Thank you. I have a question. I'm not sure if this question will make sense or what you could do with this, but while you were speaking about the archetype of the alcoholic and our dilemma and this and that, I started to wonder, well, is there also an archetype of the recovered alcoholic? And are these different things, or what could you say about that?
So that's a great question, because that really gets to the core of this image as an archetype, and as a paradoxical image of wholeness, which we haven't talked about wholeness yet. So and it's probably safe to say that most of us, when we encounter the word wholeness, we don't have a, so Jung would define it differently than the rest of us, right? And sort of at the basis of his definition of wholeness is that a person does not achieve wholeness or enlightenment by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And so when we talk about wholeness, then we're really talking about encompassing our entire being. And that includes the lowest, kind of most depraved aspects of our humanity, and literally putting those at the same level as our highest religious experiences. Jung said that most humans are murky at best, right? Like that if we were puddles of water, like you might be able to see the bottom, but maybe not, and that we're all essentially the same. And so when we So the reason that the alcoholic archetype is such a powerful image for us, especially like in recovery, is because we understand how it encompasses both the lowest and the highest, right? So most people, including like therapists, bishops, like everybody in the world except people in recovery, they only can see one half of this this image, right? The alcoholic. There's nothing good about being an alcoholic, right? It carries a lot of sort of weight, a lot of kind of dirty, dark energy. You know, it's one of my therapists once told me that if I call myself an alcoholic, I'm bottlenecking myself. And you know, I actually stopped working with him because he just wasn't my guy. But the point is that, so that's fine that people see this way, right? But in recovery, I know, you know, hundreds of people, if not thousands, and I've probably heard 10,000 people say, I'm a grateful alcoholic, right? And that they wouldn't sacrifice being an alcoholic. They wouldn't trade, you know, that their life was perfect just the way it was because it got them to this point. And so they're not going to just stop calling themselves an alcoholic. In fact, calling themselves an alcoholic is the single most empowering thing that they do in their lives. So and this is not my opinion. This is like empirical data, right? We see this happening in the 12-step fellowships every day, every meeting, every hour, all across the world. So that tells me then that this archetype, there's something about it, right? That it encompasses the entire human experience. And so that's why this was one of the main reasons that I think, I guess, allowed this archetype to sort of bubble up in my consciousness, was understanding the dichotomous nature of it, right? That it is both the highest and the lowest. So we're going to talk about this next week, but the image, so the trickster in ancient times, the trickster actually undergoes a transformation and becomes the shaman. So that happens both in the tribe, right? Like just in real life in the physical world, but it also happens within the psyche, right? That the trickster element of the psyche, that aspect that tricks us into making bad decisions and almost kills us, that aspect also goes through a transformation in the background of the psyche and becomes helpful, and it becomes the shaman, right? And then in my understanding, the shaman then in the psyche actually helps the other psychic complexes or the other parts to also transition into their higher natures as well. So that's where the depth of the archetype of the alcoholic really comes into play. I mean, you can refract this thing off so many other psychological complexes. One of the ones, if anyone's familiar with Jungian work and alchemy specifically, Jung talks a lot about the Mercurius duplex. So, and Mercury is one of the gods, and Hermes. And in alchemy, there was this kind of like numinous character called Mercurius, and it was a duplex because it also encompasses the lowest and the highest. So Mercurius is a representation of all that's despicable about human nature on one hand, but then it's also literally compared to Jesus Christ on the other hand. So it encompasses this really wide range of energy, right? And so the archetype of the alcoholic is a modern rendition of that Mercurius duplex. So if you ever get into dreams and you understand the archetype of the alcoholic and you want to study Jungian alchemy specifically, you can use the archetype of the alcoholic as sort of a framework for understanding the Mercurius duplex, which is an otherwise almost insurmountable obstacle for somebody who doesn't have firsthand experience of it. So.
Yeah, thank you, Cody. I think you've also just explained what's going on the shadow work discussion WhatsApp group. Binti, come in.
Hi. Oh, Cody, thank you so much. You know, almost everything you say, I have these light bulbs going off. And things connecting and tying together. I wanted to share with you a lot during the last week, actually, since the last meeting. The last meeting, I was listening to it, and this is what I think led to the experience I had after. I was listening to your talk, and I was on a coach, and it was dark. I was driving through the night, and so I was completely focused, totally absorbed, and I didn't realize how much internally I'd been moving and, you know, reshaping by listening to what you were saying. In that, I presume, because in that, when I get off the coach, I've experienced lucid dreaming many times in my life, but what I experienced was, I don't know if it was active imagination, I don't know what Jungian term to put in, but it was like everything felt completely surreal. And what enacted, I mean, I wish I could put you there. I wish I could paint it for you, because it was a one-off for me in my life. It was such an extraordinary experience. It was like an enactment. It was like I was living through a dream. Everything felt surreal. Anyway, I will write to you because I want your feedback on it, and I'll give you the details. But within the next half an hour of my life, I went right into the shadow of the darkness, which was, I was actually, I won't go into details, going to write it to you. I'll take too much time doing it now. And then there was an absolute transcendence. But what it showed me again, which is what I'd written in the chat last time, but I hadn't managed to get an answer yet, was what happens to the stuff that isn't soluble? You know, because this thing of the bipolar nature, because I met that again in this surreal experience that I mean, it was a real life experience, but it was completely dreamlike. It was extraordinary. What happens to those aspects in the shadow that aren't transmutable, that aren't soluble? Because, that's one of my questions. And the other was, I just wanted to share, when I stopped drinking, I launched into getting as much conscious contact as I possibly can, you know, that yearning. I absolutely, and I seem to know in my being what to do. Like I would be in a meeting, I'd be in 3 meetings today, then I'd rush home and I would go,
Please get your second question, and let's let Cody talk. We're almost out of time.
Okay, I'm sorry. That was going to become a question, but it was taking far too long. No, the main thing is, you talked last week about the soluble and the insoluble. So what happens to the aspects?
Okay.
Yeah, maybe I can't put it into a question. I'm really sorry. I just so wanted to share it and hear your feedback, but I can't do it in this context.
Thank you.
I'll write it to you. Thank you.
Please do. And I'm going to put my my email in the chat. Then you can email me directly just to make sure that I get
I'll
it.
do it.
That would be lovely. I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I like what you're saying about the soluble versus the insoluble, right? Because there's so many so the imagery is quite interesting. So in the image we saw earlier, you know, the king gets chopped up into little pieces and then drowned or ground up just into a fine powder. And then they put some water back on him and a little salt and then throw him in the oven, and boom, we get a new king. So I think it's a really good image actually that you bring up regarding like an insoluble you know, that what about those really heavy elements in the unconscious that we're probably aware of, but that we can't seem to get any movement out of? You know, some of the images or some of the psychic complexes are a little more malleable, and it's almost like, yeah, you know, you pour a little water on there that's kind of like dirt, it'll absorb the water, it kind of grows, and then whatever it is will break up, and we can sort of integrate it more easily. What I would recommend with a very insoluble kind of lump of matter that's like lodged in the unconscious, I would suggest trying to give it a shape, some sort of symbol. It could be a lump of clay, it could be a pile of crap, it could be like some unmined gold, you know, whatever it is, something that's solid. But then what you just, so Jung calls this active imagination, right? And then, so once we can give form to these energies, then, you know, understanding that symbols, living symbols, are dynamic, then we can allow those energies, or the symbols of the energies, we can sort of manipulate them and cause them to change in our own psyche. And you would do this through journaling. You could write a song about it, you could draw a picture of it, but you want to engage with the symbol. So whatever that energy is, give it a form and then engage with it, and give it a place, and like give it its existence, allow it to be there, and maybe you can get it to break up a little bit. That's what I would say.
Thank you. Melissa, come on in.
Thanks, Cody and everybody. And my mind is still back on Patrick's original question when he started this off, and he was asking about, like, if I remember right, my brain's kind of fuzzy because I'm not well, but the idea that it's not always the alcoholic image, symbol that's really the trouble. And I think back on my own journey, I didn't start out at age 5 having problems with alcohol. I started out at age 5 looking like a tornado to my parents, had a hard time with my mercurial moods. So if I had to think about what was my core identity in the beginning, it was a person who couldn't handle reality easily, and I couldn't handle my own moods. So that's the work waiting for me in sobriety. But I really like thinking about how the archetypes that I find relevant to me are changing. And as I do Enneagram work, I go, oh, well, I'm kind of the creative alchemist anyway. I've always been somebody that makes, you know, gold out of straw, but I go through a lot of pain before. Anyway, not a question, just a comment that it's very nebulous, these beautiful images that come to us as we're listening to you talk.
Thanks, Melissa. I appreciate that. I like what Jacoby says too, you know, that, this, because obviously, like, the archetype of the alcoholic, you know, and I agree with you, like, so much, like the you know, Jung says that the real problems in life never get solved. And to me, it feels like, at least at this point, that alcoholism is not one of those problems for me. That it seems that the problem of alcoholism has been solved. So there are, and that's the thing, like, and I kind of, you know, meant to make this point. I'm going to try to make it in weeks to come, is that what we do in the 12 steps is we do some shadow work, right? But Jung says that with relatively little effort, a person can see through their shadow, right? And that there's layers beneath that are much more dangerous and scary and dark. And like Edinger says, you know, for me especially, it's like, it's getting down to the masculine and the feminine, and how I relate to those, what those mean to me. Obviously, those, you know, heavily, what plays into that heavily is my relationship with my parents, my relationship with my kids. And I find that, you know, there's a lot of work to be done still in those deeper layers, that, and so, you know, I think that we get a good introduction to this kind of work through the 12 steps. I try to, you know, in my book too, but always with this understanding that there's so much deeper that we can go and take this stuff. So
Thanks, Cody. We're just past the top of the hour. Shall we move toward wrapping up for today? Then we can have fellowship time after.
sure.
Okay. Let me move over here. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate you being here. Thanks for coming back each week. Friendly Circle Berlin is seeking support with editing videos for the YouTube channel. Please contact Patrick. Cody's presentations are posted on his website at cody-peterson.com. and on the Friendly Circle Berlin channels. Our next presentation will be next Tuesday here at the same time and place, and everyone is welcome to stay on for a while after we close today. Let's make it so everyone can unmute and we can say the Serenity Prayer together if you like.